Tax us more, but not our companies. That is the clear message from India Inc. to the Finance Minister, with just a few hours to go before the Union Budget is presented. CNBC-TV18, in partnership with Kpmg, has carried out an extensive pre-budget survey across India Inc. Now, nearly 300 senior finance professionals from over 15 sectors were polled with questions on their budget expectations. The results are revealing, to say the least. Here is the biggest revelation. 74% of the CEOs polled support additional measures on ultra-high income earners. 74% there. This is basically those who earn more than 5 crore rupees per annum. Only 26% are against any such measures. There is already a 15% surcharge on those earning more than 1 crore rupees. But let's now talk about corporate tax. A majority, that's nearly 55%, expect the government to cut the tax rate. Another 39% expect a status quo. Not just that, 80% of the CEOs polled expect personal income taxes to go down, with only 17% expecting income tax to remain unchanged. So again, a majority there believes that there is a cut coming as far as personal income tax is concerned. Of a majority of nearly 62% of CEOs polled expect the minimum alternate tax, or the MAT, to remain unchanged. Now, what do CEOs fear the most? 62% of India Inc. believes that long-term capital gains tax on equities has emerged as the biggest apprehension. Will this budget take it forward or not? That's the big question. The next question, has the government's measures provided tax certainty? Only 13% of India Inc. say the government measures have in fact provided tax certainty. Over 49% of India Inc. say the government has a long way to go in providing tax certainty. But at the same time, when asked if the tax environment has improved in the last 1 year, a majority, that's nearly 68% of the CEOs polled, said yes, there has been an improvement in the tax environment in the past year. 32% said no. Well, joining us now to discuss all of this is the team at Kpmg behind this survey. Arun Kumar, the chairman and CEO of Kpmg India, Sachin Menon, partner and head of indirect tax, and Hitesh Gajaria, who's also a partner at Kpmg. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18. Mr. Arun Kumar, let me start by asking you about what is the biggest revelation as far as this CEO poll is concerned. Most CEOs, a majority of the CEOs polled, believe that there should be more measures to tax the ultra-rich, not so much on the companies, but on the ultra-rich. Our source is telling us that perhaps an inheritance tax or an estate tax is unlikely in this budget. But the poll seems to suggest that India Inc. is ready, even if that were to be the case.
I'm not sure that should be such a surprise, because around the world, you'll find that business leaders are in favor of taxation that's equitable, and having a higher tax rate on the ultra-rich is very much an equitable measure. So it's not so surprising to me that that was the result of the survey.
Okay, you're saying that that was not surprising to you, but Mr. Kumar, let me ask you, what if the government does decide to go in for any measures now to specifically target the ultra-rich? We've already got that surcharge on people with an annual income of more than 1 crore rupees. What is the expectation?
Now, I would
if not an inheritance tax or an estate tax?
Yeah, on the expectation, I would leave that to my colleague Hitesh Gajaria to guess on that. But broadly, I would say that our survey showed that most people felt that personal taxes will stay the same or will decrease, with the exception of the ultra-rich as it was characterized.
Okay, Hitesh, so you want to take a stab at that? What would, if the poll is suggesting that people are bracing themselves for more measures, specifically when it comes to the ultra-rich, what are you expecting?
Well, we can take a leaf out of what UK did 2 years ago. They introduced a top rate of 50% on all incomes over a certain threshold. I believe that threshold was over £500,000. If the survey is anything to go by, then many people are expecting that those earning incomes of more than 5 crores could possibly end up paying a higher tax rate of not 30%, but say 40%.
Okay, so that's the expectation. Those with incomes of higher than 5 crores could end up with a higher tax on them. But, you know, Mr. Kumar, let me come back to you now and let me extrapolate this argument to what the poll is suggesting on the corporate tax front. And the expectation is, look what's happening in the US. India needs to move and reduce corporate taxes, and that was the stated objective and the promise made by this finance minister when he came to office. Majority still believe that the finance minister will cut the corporate tax rate down to 25%. In light of what we've seen from the economic survey and other commentary from the government, are you hopeful?
I believe I am hopeful because there are also international factors at play. For example, the Trump administration's decision to reduce corporate taxes significantly to 21% is going to be a competitive factor. So we are in competition for investment with other countries, including the United States. So in general, I believe that it is a competitive issue for us in India to address the corporate tax rate. Remember that Indian companies will have to make decisions in terms of where they invest.
Yeah.
And clearly, India needs to be attractive for Indian companies to invest as well as for foreign companies. So today, a US company needs to decide whether they invest in India or decide in the US. The change in the corporate tax rate in the US, you know, tilts the advantage in many cases towards the US. So it's important for that issue to be addressed here.
Okay, so you're saying from a competitiveness point of view, the government needs to bring down the corporate tax rate given what's happening in countries like the US. But Hitesh, specifically on some of the other tax measures, you know, whether it's the DDT or it's the MAT or it's the STT, the poll believes that it's likely to be status quo. We're unlikely to see any meaningful change or any change at all. Is that something that you concur with?
So, as the poll reveals, if the corporate tax rate is indeed cut to 25%, and I believe this government had started on that journey, albeit with smaller steps, in both the last Finance Act and the year before that, they cut the corporate tax rate to 25% for smaller companies and for companies which started manufacturing after a certain date. Now, if they indeed go boldly forth and looking at the competitive environment, looking at also the region in aspect where we are, actually India has the highest corporate headline rate. Even if you look at the OECD countries, barring perhaps Belgium and France, India's tax rate of 30% is probably the highest. So if they were to really be bold and reduce the corporate tax rate to only 25%, then as a corollary, in order that the government does not lose revenues, dividend distribution tax and the buyback tax we don't hope to reduce. Now, if on the other hand, long-term capital gains tax is introduced on listed shares and on equity-oriented mutual funds which are held beyond 12 months, then there is a logical case to abolish completely the securities transaction tax. So I think
transaction tax.
You know, the
but what is the chance of that? You know, the poll shows that the poll shows that people are very apprehensive about the introduction or a reintroduction of the long-term capital gains tax. But I ask you this in the context of what we saw from the chief economic advisor in the economic survey, talking about the possibility of a stall or a capital outflow from the Indian stock markets. One, because valuations are not justifiable. So do you believe that given where the markets are today, that we could expect any intervention by way of a long-term capital gains tax to upset the party, Mr. Kumar, as well as Hitesh?
So my take on this is, my take on this is really that the government perhaps should not introduce this capital gains tax at this juncture. If we will see the last budget as well as I would expect in the current budget, disinvestment to take of proceeds to be a lion's share of revenue for the government. If it wants to keep its fiscal deficit in check, then perhaps this is not the appropriate time. Given that the market is good, the government has a golden opportunity for disinvestment, and the capital gains tax introduction at this time would just spoil the party. Sorry, Arun, go on.
You know, I would agree that tinkering with the capital gains tax at this point may not be wise. For instance, foreign direct investment has been rising, did better last year, and the second half of last year did even better than the first half of last year. Private investment, according to the economic survey, is at the cusp of a turnaround. So at that point, would it be a wise thing to tinker with the capital gains tax rate? I'm not sure.
Yes, You're not sure, and that is a red flag that CEOs are going to be watching out for as well. And my take from a plain reading of the economic survey is that it's unlikely that the government would want to mess with sentiment at this point in time. But who knows, given the revenue constraints. Sachin Menon, you've been awfully quiet, and that is because indirect taxes, not much action is expected this time around, given the fact that the GST Council will take those decisions. But what would your key expectation be, specifically around the areas of corporate tax, etc.? And also, I want to ask you, one of the questions that we polled where there is an improvement visibly in the tax environment is what the poll suggests, but they're also talking about the lack of tax certainty. So how do you reconcile the two? On one hand, the poll says there's an improvement. On the other hand, they say that we've got a long way to go before there is tax certainty.
Well, despite all this confusion, if you see the last 3 years' revenue trend, the indirect tax as well as the corporate tax collections are steadily increasing, despite the fact that there is a dip in the GDP growth. So as far as the government is concerned, I think the economy is growing, and the tax which is collected is also going up. And in this scenario, there is expectation that from the perspective of indirect taxes, if not in this budget, but before the budget bill is passed, there could be some good news with respect to reduction in the GST rates. States may not stand in the way of such reduction proposals, because for one reason, that if you remember, the compensation is benchmarked at the rate of 14% growth of revenue year over year, as against the actual revenue growth for the states was, if you take a couple of years together, it is nothing more than 4 to 6%. In that place, they are assured of the next 5 years a revenue growth of 14% in terms of the compensation.
We don't even need to work on that assumption, because if you see what the economic survey says, then states have actually benefited from the GST in terms of the share of revenue from taxes that's gone up significantly after the rollout of the GST. And you're right on the fact that we could see more changes with the rates. I asked this question today to the chief economic advisor, because he continues to push the idea of a single rate and a revenue neutral rate of 15 to 16%. That's unlikely to happen, at least over the next few years. But the possibility of more rate changes is certainly imminent, and of course, eventually perhaps converging to 3 rates in the near future. Sachin Menon, do you believe a 3-rate structure as well as more rate modifications on the anvil?
I think so, because if you see that despite the last 2 months, there was the dip in the rate of collection. This month it is shown up, and it would logically it is so, because the carry forward credit is getting exhausted, and the industries started paying the tax in cash, and therefore the collection is going up, and I expect that in the coming months it is yet improve further. And therefore, I would logically expect that if the revenue trend is buoyant, the government would not mind cutting the rate and reducing the number of slabs, so that the industry's expectations are met.
Yeah, well, speaking of slabs, we will talk about what the expectation is on personal income tax. A majority believes that there is going to be relief coming in for the salaried class in Budget 2018. We'll take up those findings and more when we return. You're watching the CNBC-TV18 Kpmg pre-budget poll.